The iron shackles around my ankles had worn raw wounds that refused to heal. Each jolt of the wagon wheels against the rocky trail sent fresh waves of agony through my battered body, but I had long since stopped crying out. 3 weeks of this torment had taught me that silence was my only armor against the cruel laughter of the men who rode alongside my mobile prison. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rebecca Morrison, and I was being transported across the Nebraska Territory as what they called a punishment bride, a woman condemned to marry a stranger as payment for debts I had never incurred. The year was 1868, and in the lawless expanse between established settlements, a woman's fate could be decided by men who viewed her as nothing more than chattel to be traded, sold, or bartered. The wagon that held me captive was a converted freight hauler, its wooden sides reinforced with iron bars that turned it into a cage on wheels. A canvas tarp stretched overhead provided minimal protection from the scorching sun and driving rain that had alternated for days. The floor was covered with moldy straw that reeked of previous occupants, other women who had made this same terrible journey before me. My wrists bore the permanent indentations of rope burns from the countless times I had been bound and unbound. During the 3 weeks since my capture, the men transporting me, a group of 5 rough bounty hunters led by a man called Dutch Morrison, took perverse pleasure in reminding me that resistance was futile. Dutch claimed to be my uncle, though I had never seen him before the day he arrived at the boarding house in Kansas City with legal papers declaring him my guardian and me his property to dispose of as he saw fit. The documents were forgeries, of course, but in a territory where law enforcement was sparse and corruption rampant, forged papers carried the same weight as legitimate ones. My real parents had died of cholera when I was 16, leaving me with a small inheritance that I had been carefully managing while working as a seamstress in Kansas City. I had been making an honest living, planning eventually to open my own dress shop when Dutch appeared with his fabricated claim and 3 armed men to enforce it. "Your daddy owed me money before he died," Dutch had explained with a yellow-toothed grin as his men ransacked my modest room. "Gambling debts, signed and witnessed. Since he can't pay, you'll work off what's owed. Got a buyer in Colorado Territory who'll pay good money for a healthy young bride. You'll marry him, bear his children, and your father's debt will be considered settled." I had tried to run that first night, slipping from the boarding house window and making it nearly 6 blocks before they caught me. The beating that followed left me unconscious for 2 days. When I awoke, I found myself in this wagon, shackled, like a dangerous animal, beginning a journey westward toward a fate worse than death. The man who had purchased me was named Silas Crawford, a wealthy cattle rancher who owned vast stretches of grazing land in the Colorado Territory. According to Dutch, Crawford was in his 50s, had already buried 2 wives under suspicious circumstances, and had a reputation for brutality that extended far beyond his treatment of livestock. He wanted a young wife who could bear him sons, and had paid Dutch $500 for the privilege of owning me completely. Crawford doesn't tolerate disobedience, Dutch had informed me one evening as we camped beside a muddy creek. His last wife tried to run back east. They found her body 3 days later, torn up by wolves. Least, that's what Crawford claimed. You'd be wise to remember that when you meet him. The other men in Dutch's company were cut from the same coarse cloth. There was Pike Stevens, a gaunt man with dead eyes who had served time in Leavenworth for assault. Jake Morrison, no relation to Dutch despite the shared surname, was a former Confederate deserter who wore his hatred of authority like a badge of honor. Charlie Hendricks was the youngest at perhaps 25, but his youth hadn't prevented him from developing a taste for casual cruelty that seemed to worsen with each passing day of our journey. The 5th man, Lewis Blake, served as their tracker and navigator. He was perhaps the most dangerous of them all, not because of any propensity for violence, but because of his intelligence. Blake could read sign like others read books, plan routes that avoided military patrols and hostile Indian territory, and had an uncanny ability to procure supplies from settlements and trading posts through a combination of charm and carefully veiled threats. For 3 weeks, I had endured their constant surveillance, their crude jokes about my future with Crawford, and their increasingly bold suggestions about what they might do with me if their buyer failed to pay as promised. I had been fed just enough to keep me alive, stale bread, strips of jerky so tough they made my jaw ache, and water that tasted of rust from their battered canteens. Sleep came in fitful snatches as the wagon rolled continuously westward. Dutch was eager to complete the transaction and collect his payment, driving his company hard across terrain that grew increasingly rugged as we moved deeper into the territories. When they did stop to rest, usually for only a few hours before dawn, I remained shackled in the wagon while they took turns standing guard. My attempts to escape had become less frequent as my strength waned, but I never stopped looking for opportunities. During river crossings, when the wagon wheels bogged down in mud, when sudden storms forced them to take shelter, I watched and waited for any moment of inattention that might allow me to slip away. But Dutch and his men had transported merchandise before, and they had learned to anticipate every desperate scheme a captive woman might attempt. The landscape around us had changed dramatically over the course of our journey. The rolling farmlands of Kansas had given way to the vast prairies of Nebraska, then to the increasingly broken country that marked the approach to the Rocky Mountains. Buffalo grass stretched endlessly in all directions, interrupted by occasional stands of cottonwood that marked the meandering course of creeks and rivers. It was a beautiful country, in its own harsh way, but I had little opportunity to appreciate the scenery. My world had contracted to the dimensions of my wooden prison, measured in the space between the iron bars and the length of chain that connected my ankle shackles. I knew every splinter in the wagon's floor, every rust stain on the metal that confined me, every sound the wheels made when they hit different types of terrain. On this particular morning, I had long since lost the exact track of the date. We were traveling through an area that Blake called the Sand Hills, a region of rolling grassland dotted with small lakes and marshes. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, though the sun still carried enough heat to make the canvas covering of my wagon stifling by midday. Dutch rode his horse alongside the wagon, close enough that I could hear him discussing their route. With Blake, they were perhaps 2 days from a trading post called Fort Mitchell, where they planned to resupply before making the final push toward Crawford's ranch in Colorado. I had overheard enough of their conversations to understand that they were behind schedule and growing nervous about potential pursuit. Not that anyone was actually pursuing us. I had no family to raise the alarm, no influential friends who might pressure authorities to investigate my disappearance. In Kansas City, I was simply another young woman who had vanished from the boarding house district, a common enough occurrence that few would think to question it. Dutch had covered his tracks well, spreading a story that I had fallen into disgrace and fled eastward in shame. But Dutch was the suspicious type who saw threats where none existed, and his paranoia had been increasing as we moved deeper into territory where his forged papers might be challenged by authorities who actually knew the law. Military patrols from various forts occasionally swept through the area, looking for deserters, hostile Indians, or outlaws. While Dutch's business skirted the edges of legality, it wasn't technically illegal to transport a willing bride to her future husband, especially with documentation that appeared to support his guardianship. The problem was that I was far from willing, and my physical condition made it obvious that I was being held against my will. If a cavalry patrol stopped us for inspection, even the most corrupt officer would have questions about a shackled woman covered in bruises and barely conscious from malnutrition. "We're being watched," Blake announced suddenly, his voice cutting through my fevered thoughts. He had reined in his horse and was studying the horizon to the north. Through a small brass telescope, Dutch immediately became alert, his hand moving to the rifle scabbard on his saddle. Indians? Maybe. Could be soldiers. Too far to tell for certain, but there's definitely movement on that ridge line. Pike and Jake had heard the exchange and were already checking their weapons. Charlie, who had been walking alongside the wagon to rest his horse, quickly mounted and moved to a position where he could cover our back trail. How many? The Dutch demanded. Blake continued his surveillance through the telescope. Hard to say. At least 3, maybe more. They're staying just below the skyline, but I caught the sun reflecting off something metallic. Could be weapons, could be military brass. For several minutes, the entire company remained frozen in tense watchfulness. I found myself hoping desperately that it was a cavalry patrol, even though I knew the chances of rescue were slim. Dutch's papers might not withstand close scrutiny, but they would likely be sufficient to satisfy a casual inspection, especially if backed up by the testimony of his 4 armed companions. They're moving parallel to us, Blake reported. Keeping their distance but definitely tracking our course. The Dutch made a decision. Charlie, ride ahead and scout the trail. Make sure we're not heading into an ambush. Pike, you drop back and watch our rear. Jake, you stay close to the wagon. Blake, keep watching those riders. As the men repositioned themselves according to Dutch's orders, I pressed my face against the iron bars of my cage and tried to catch a glimpse of our mysterious observers. The rolling terrain made it impossible to see more than a few hundred yards in any direction, but knowing that someone was out there, anyone who wasn't part of Dutch's company, filled me with a desperate hope. I hadn't felt in weeks. The wagon resumed its westward progress, but at a more cautious pace. Dutch was clearly worried about the unknown riders, and his nervousness infected the rest of his men. They kept glancing toward the northern ridgeline, hands never straying far from their weapons. As the morning wore on, Blake continued to spot occasional signs of our shadowy pursuers. They maintained their distance but showed no signs of breaking off their surveillance. By midday, Dutch's anxiety had reached a boiling point. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Damn it, Blake, what do you think they want? He snarled, pulling his horse up beside the tracker. Blake lowered his telescope and shook his head. If they're soldiers, they'd have approached us by now with flags flying. If they're hostile, they'd have either attacked or disappeared. This feels like something else entirely. What? Kind of something else? Maybe bounty hunters like us. Could be they're transporting their own cargo and don't want any interference. Could be outlaws who think we're carrying something valuable. Hell, could be prospectors who don't want competition if they found color somewhere in these hills. None of these possibilities seemed to reassure the Dutch. He was a man accustomed to being the predator, not the prey. And the sensation of being watched by unknown eyes was clearly eating at his composure. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, our mysterious observers finally made their intentions clear. Charlie, who had been scouting ahead, came galloping back with news that changed everything. There's a war party waiting at the creek crossing, he reported breathlessly. At least a dozen warriors, maybe more. They're not hiding, set up right out in the open like they want us to see them. Dutch's face went pale. Lakota? Looked like it from a distance. War paint, eagle feathers, the whole show. They're not moving to attack, just sitting on their horses and waiting. Blake nodded grimly. That explains our shadows. Those riders we've been seeing are probably scouts, reporting our position back to the main party. The reality of our situation hit me like a physical blow. I was trapped between 2 groups of dangerous men, both capable of violence, neither likely to have my welfare as their primary concern. If Dutch's company tried to fight their way through a Lakota war party, I would likely be killed in the crossfire. If they surrendered or were overwhelmed, my fate at the hands of hostile warriors might be even worse than what awaited me with Silas Crawford. Dutch was furiously considering his options, none of which seemed particularly appealing. "How far is the crossing?" "Maybe 2 miles, Charlie replied. "Flat ground, no cover. If we try to go around, we'll add at least a day to our journey, and there's no guarantee they won't just follow us to another crossing. Could we turn back?" Jake suggested. "Find another route?" Blake shook his head. "We're running low on supplies. Fort Mitchell is the closest resupply point, and it's on the other side of that creek. We turn back now, we'll be traveling on empty stomachs within 2 days." As the men debated their choices, I found myself studying the horizon with new eyes. Somewhere out there, Lakota warriors were waiting, and for the first time since my capture, the prospect of violence didn't fill me with pure dread. These Indians might kill me, but they might also kill Dutch and his men in the process. Either outcome would be preferable to spending the rest of my life as Silas Crawford's brutalized wife. The sun was beginning to set, painting the grassland in shades of gold and crimson when Dutch finally made his decision. We would camp where we were for the night and approach the crossing at first light, hoping that daylight might make the Lakota more amenable to negotiation or less likely to attack without provocation. As the men made their preparations for what might be their final night on Earth, I lay in my wagon prison and stared up at the emerging stars. Tomorrow would bring either rescue or death, and for the first time in 3 weeks, I found myself almost eager to see what dawn would bring. Chains around my ankles felt lighter somehow, as if the mere possibility of change had loosened their grip on my soul. Whatever happened at that creek crossing, my nightmare journey as Dutch Morrison's prisoner was approaching its end. Dawn came too soon and not soon enough. I had spent the night listening to Dutch and his men argue in hushed tones around their campfire, debating strategies that ranged from attempting to negotiate passage to making a desperate run for the creek, crossing under cover of darkness. None of their plans filled me with confidence, and all of them treated me as merely another piece of cargo to be protected or abandoned. Based on convenience, the morning mist hung low over the grassland as Dutch roused his men before sunrise. They moved with the nervous efficiency of soldiers preparing for battle, checking weapons and redistributing ammunition while stealing glances toward the creek where the Lakota war party waited. Blake used his telescope to conduct a final reconnaissance, reporting that the warriors remained in position, their numbers apparently unchanged from the previous day. "Still a dozen of them," he confirmed, collapsing the brass instrument with a sharp click. "Maybe 13. Hard to get an exact count with the morning haze, but they're definitely not going anywhere." The Dutch spat into the dying embers of their fire. "Indians always negotiate. Everything's got a price with them. We offer them some trade goods, maybe one of the horses, and they'll let us pass." Pike snorted derisively as he loaded his rifle. "Have you ever tried negotiating with a Lakota war party, Dutch? They ain't exactly known for their reasonable nature." "They're men, same as us," Dutch replied, though his voice carried less conviction than his words. "They want something, or they'd have attacked already. Question is what?" Jake finished securing his bedroll to his saddle and looked pointedly at my wagon. "Maybe what they want ain't something we're prepared to give up." The implication hung in the air like smoke. All 5 men understood that a young white woman represented considerable value to Indian raiders, both as a captive to be ransomed and as a trophy to demonstrate their prowess in battle. If the Lakota were specifically interested in me, no amount of horses or trade goods would satisfy them. Dutch's jaw tightened as he considered this possibility. He had invested too much time and effort in transporting me to Crawford's ranch to simply hand me over to Indians, but he was also pragmatic enough to recognize that dead men collected no payments. If it came down to a choice between his life and his profit, I had no illusions about which he would choose. "We'll approach under a flag of truce," he finally decided. "Blake, you speak some Indian, don't you?" "A little Lakota. Picked up from traders," Blake admitted reluctantly. "Enough to ask for water or directions. Not enough for complex negotiations. It'll have to do. Charlie, you carry the white flag. Stay back with the wagon while Blake and I ride forward to the parley. Pike and Jake, you position yourselves where you can cover our retreat if things go south." As the men implemented Dutch's plan, I found myself gripping the iron bars of my cage with white-knuckled intensity. Everything that happened in the next hour would determine whether I continued toward my fate as Crawford's bride, or found myself facing an entirely different kind of captivity among the Lakota. Neither prospect offered much hope, but the unknown seemed preferable to the certainty of brutalization that awaited me in Colorado. The wagon began its slow advance toward the creek crossing, with Dutch and Blake riding ahead under Charlie's makeshift flag of truce. From my position in the cage, I could see the Lakota warriors clearly for the first time as the morning mist lifted. They sat their painted ponies in a loose semicircle on the far side of the creek, weapons visible but not immediately threatening. Their leader was immediately apparent, a tall warrior, mounted on a magnificent black stallion. His chest bare except for an elaborate bone breastplate, his face marked with red and white paint in patterns I didn't recognize. Eagle feathers adorned his long black hair, and he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to command. Even at this distance, his presence seemed to dominate the entire scene. Beside him rode a younger warrior, perhaps in his 20s, whose paint and feathers suggested high status within the war party. The others were arranged in what appeared to be a careful hierarchy, with the most experienced fighters closest to their leader and the younger men positioned on the flanks. Dutch and Blake halted their horses approximately 50 yards from the creek bank and waited. After a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the Lakota leader urged his stallion forward into the shallow water, stopping in the center of the creek. His message was clear. He would meet them halfway, but no closer. Blake dismounted and approached the water's edge on foot, his hands visible and empty. He called out in halting Lakota, his words carrying back to the wagon on the morning breeze. I couldn't understand the language, but his tone was respectful, almost deferential. The response came in heavily accented English that shocked me with its clarity. "You travel through Lakota land without permission," the warrior chief declared, his voice carrying easily across the water. "You carry weapons and move like men with something to hide. Why should we allow you to pass?" Dutch seemed as surprised as I was by the Indian's command of English, but he quickly recovered his composure. "We're honest traders," he called out, his voice pitched to carry confidence he clearly didn't feel. "Heading to Fort Mitchell for supplies, then on to Colorado territory. We mean no harm to the Lakota people." The chief's laugh was sharp and without humor. "Honest traders do not cage women like animals. Show us what you carry in your wagon." My heart leaped at his words. These warriors knew about me and had probably been observing our company for longer than Blake had realized. The demand to see me wasn't a casual request, it was the real reason. They had chosen to block our passage. Dutch's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. He clearly hadn't expected his cargo to become a topic of conversation. "The woman is my ward," he shouted back. "Family business, none of your concern." "All women's suffering is our concern," the chief replied, his tone growing colder. "Bring the wagon forward. Let us see this ward who requires chains." I held my breath as Dutch weighed his options. He could refuse and almost certainly provoke a fight his company couldn't win, or he could comply and risk losing me to the Indians anyway. After a moment of internal struggle, pragmatism won out. He gestured for Charlie to bring the wagon closer to the creek. As we rolled forward, I became acutely aware of how I must appear to these warriors. 3 weeks of captivity had taken their toll. My dress was torn and filthy. My hair hung in matted tangles, and the chains around my ankles were clearly visible through the wagon bars. The bruises on my face and arms told their own story of the treatment I had endured. The Lakota chief studied me intently as the wagon came to a halt at the creek's edge. His dark eyes seemed to take in every detail of my condition, and I saw something shift in his expression, a hardening of features that suggested barely controlled anger. "What is your name?" he asked me directly, his English precise despite the accent. I glanced nervously at Dutch, who was clearly struggling with whether to allow me to respond. Before he could intervene, I found my voice. "Rebecca Morrison," I called out, surprised by how weak and raspy I sounded after weeks of minimal conversation. "Rebecca Morrison," the chief repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "Are you this man's willing ward?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. I knew that my answer would determine what happened next, not just to me but to Dutch and his men. If I claimed to be traveling willingly, the Lakota might allow our passage to continue. If I told the truth about my captivity, violence would almost certainly follow. Looking at Dutch's desperate face, at the weapons his men were carefully positioning, at the impossibility of my situation, regardless of what happened here, I made my choice. "No," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I'm being held against my will. These men kidnapped me from Kansas City and are taking me to Colorado to be sold as a bride. I'm chained in this wagon because I tried to escape." The effect of my words was immediate and dramatic. Dutch began cursing violently, his hand moving toward his rifle. Pike and Jake shifted their positions to better cover the Indian party. Charlie actually took a step backward, as if trying to distance himself from what was about to unfold. But it was the reaction of the Lakota warriors that truly caught my attention. The chief's face transformed from merely serious to genuinely dangerous, his hand moving to the war club hanging from his belt. The younger warrior beside him said something in rapid Lakota that caused several of the others to notch arrows to their bowstrings. "You steal women," the chief said, his voice carrying across the water like the rumble of distant thunder. "You cage them like beasts, you sell them like horses." He paused, his dark eyes fixed on Dutch with an intensity that seemed to burn. "Such men have no place in Lakota territory." Dutch was sweating now, clearly realizing that his carefully planned negotiation had collapsed into something far more dangerous. "Now hold on," he called out, trying to project authority he no longer possessed. "This is a family matter, like I said. The girl's lying because she doesn't want to face her responsibilities." "The chains say otherwise," the chief replied coldly. "As do the bruises on her face. As does the fear in her eyes." He said something in Lakota to his warriors, and I saw them spread out slightly, positioning themselves for what was clearly going to be an attack. Blake apparently recognized the signs as well, because he began backing away from the creek bank toward his horse. "Dutch," he called urgently, "we need to get out of here, now." But Dutch seemed frozen by the magnitude of his miscalculation. He had expected to negotiate safe passage with trade goods, or perhaps a modest payment. Instead, he found himself facing a war party that viewed him and his men as something worse than enemies, as men who preyed upon women, a crime that apparently warranted immediate and violent justice in Lakota culture. The chief raised his hand, and I realized he was about to signal the attack that would end this confrontation one way or another. In that moment, hanging between one world and another, I felt a strange sense of calm descend over me. Whatever happened next, at least the truth had been spoken. At least someone had heard my voice and believed my words. Then everything exploded into chaos. The first arrows flew as Dutch finally drew his rifle, Pike and Jake opening fire from their flanking positions, while Charlie tried desperately to turn the heavy wagon around. The Lakota warriors came out of their positions like water bursting through a dam, their war cries echoing across the grassland as they urged their ponies through the shallow creek. But this wasn't the chaotic melee I had expected. The Indian attack was coordinated, precise. designed to overwhelm Dutch's men before they could establish any kind of defensive position. 3 warriors swept wide to the left, cutting off any retreat toward the east. Another group charged straight at Pike and Jake, forcing them to abandon their covering positions and fight for their lives. The chief himself came directly for Dutch, his black stallion carrying him through the water like a force of nature. The Finja. Dutch managed to get off one shot that went wide before the warrior was on top of him, the war club descending with devastating force. In the midst of the battle, I found myself forgotten inside my wagon cage. Charlie had abandoned any attempt to control the horses, which were rearing and plunging in terror at the sounds of combat. The wagon tilted dangerously as the animals tried to bolt, and I was thrown against the iron bars with bruising force. Through the chaos, I caught glimpses of the fight unfolding around me. Blake had managed to mount his horse and was attempting to escape toward the south, but 2 young Lakota warriors were closing on him rapidly. Jake had taken cover behind a fallen log and was firing steadily, but I could see arrows striking the wood all around his position. Pike seemed to have disappeared entirely, though whether he had fled or fallen, I couldn't tell through the dust and confusion. Dutch was on the ground now, his rifle broken, facing the Lakota chief in what appeared to be hand-to-hand combat. Then, suddenly, the chief was running toward my wagon, his face streaked with war paint and blood. For a terrifying moment, I thought he intended to finish what Dutch had started, but instead he began examining the locks on my chains, his fingers moving with surprising gentleness despite the violence still raging around us. "Do not fear," he said in English, his voice somehow calm despite the chaos. "You are safe now." As he worked to free me from the shackles that had held me captive for 3 weeks, I realized that my life had just taken another dramatic turn. But for the first time since my capture in Kansas City, I felt something I had almost forgotten existed, that hope, that the sensation of freedom was overwhelming. After 3 weeks of iron shackles cutting into my ankles, the absence of weight and restriction felt almost surreal. I flexed my feet tentatively, wincing at the sharp pain that shot through muscles that had been immobilized for so long. The wounds where the metal had worn through my skin were raw and infected, but they no longer mattered. I was free. The Lakota chief had introduced himself as Red Thunder, a name that seemed to fit his commanding presence perfectly. As the dust settled from the brief but decisive battle, I looked around at what remained of Dutch Morrison's company. Pike and Jake lay motionless near the fallen log where they had made their final stand. Charlie sat against a boulder, clutching a wounded arm while blood seeped between his fingers. Dutch himself was nowhere to be seen, and I chose not to ask about his fate. Blake had managed to escape during the confusion, disappearing southward on his horse while the warriors were occupied with freeing me from the wagon. Red Thunder seemed unconcerned about the fleeing man, perhaps confident that one survivor would spread word of what happened to those who traffic in human misery. "Can you ride?" Red Thunder asked me in his careful English, studying my condition with what appeared to be genuine concern. I tried to stand and nearly collapsed as my weakened legs refused to support my weight. 3 weeks of confinement had left me barely able to walk, let alone ride a horse. "I'm not sure," I admitted, embarrassed by my helplessness. Without a word, Red Thunder lifted me as easily as if I weighed nothing, carrying me to his black stallion and settling me in front of his saddle. "You will ride with me until your strength returns," he said simply. "My people will care for you." As we began moving away from the creek crossing, I found myself studying the warriors who had just altered the course of my life so dramatically. There were 14 of them in total, ranging in age from what appeared to be barely 18 to several. Men who seemed to be in their 40s. All were painted for war, but their demeanor now was almost casual, as if rescuing captive white women was simply another part of their daily routine. The youngest warrior, who couldn't have been more than 20, rode a spotted pony with obvious pride. His face was painted with bold yellow and black stripes, and he kept glancing at me with curious eyes. When he caught me looking back, he smiled shyly and said something in Lakota that made several of the other men laugh. "Black Hawk says you have brave eyes," Red Thunder translated. "He asks if all white women are so fierce when they speak the truth." "I don't feel fierce," I replied honestly. "I feel terrified." Red Thunder considered this as we rode across the rolling grassland. "Fear and courage often walk together," he said finally. "The man who feels no fear usually lacks the wisdom to recognize danger. You spoke the truth when lies would have been safer. That required courage." The landscape we traveled through was beautiful in a way that my 3 weeks of captivity had prevented me from appreciating. The late summer grass had turned golden, rippling in waves before the constant prairie wind. Occasional groves of cottonwood marked the courses of streams and creeks, their leaves already beginning to show the first hints of autumn color. As we rode, Red Thunder began to explain the world I was entering. His band was one of several that made up the larger Oglala Lakota nation, led by a chief named Standing Bear, who was known for his wisdom in dealing with the ever-increasing presence of white settlers in traditional Lakota territory. "We are not at war with all whites," Red Thunder told me as his stallion picked its way carefully around a prairie dog town. "But we will not tolerate those who bring evil into our lands. Men who steal women, who kill for sport, who break treaties. As easily as they break promises, these we fight." I learned that the war party had been tracking Dutch's company for nearly a week, ever since traders at a distant settlement had reported seeing a wagon with a caged woman being transported westward. The description had reached Standing Bear, who had dispatched Red Thunder to investigate and, if necessary, intervene. "Why did you help me?" I asked, voicing the question that had been troubling me since my rescue. "I'm a stranger, a white woman. Surely your people have enough problems without taking on mine as well." Red Thunder was quiet for so long that I began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words revealed depths of philosophy I hadn't expected from a warrior. "My grandmother once told me that the spirits test us by placing those who need help in our path," he said. "Sometimes the test is whether we have the strength to help. Sometimes it is whether we have the wisdom to recognize who truly deserves our aid. When I saw how you were chained, how you had been beaten, I knew the spirits had sent me a test I could not fail." By midday, we had covered perhaps 15 miles from the creek crossing, moving at a steady pace across terrain that seemed to offer no landmarks to guide our way. But Red Thunder and his warriors navigated with the confidence of men intimately familiar with their territory, following invisible trails that led toward what he called the gathering place, where his band maintained their late summer camp. During our brief stops to rest the horses, I began to interact more with the other warriors. Despite the language barrier, they showed a kindness that contrasted sharply with the treatment I had received from Dutch's men. When they noticed me shivering in my torn dress, one of the older warriors offered me a buffalo robe to wrap around my shoulders. Another produced a water skin filled with what tasted like mint tea, gesturing for me to drink as much as I needed. The warrior called Black Hawk seemed particularly interested in communicating with me, using a combination of simple English words, hand gestures, and drawings scratched in the dirt to ask questions about my life before captivity. I learned that he had a sister approximately my age who had married into a band that lived several days' ride to the north, and his protective attitude toward me seemed to stem from imagining how he would want someone to treat her if she were ever in similar circumstances. "He asks about your family," Red Thunder translated during one of these conversations. "Where they are, whether they search for you." I explained as best I could about my parents' death from cholera, my life working as a seamstress in Kansas City, and Dutch's sudden appearance with his forged papers claiming guardianship. The more I revealed about my situation, the angrier the warriors seemed to become, not at me, but at the circumstances that had made my captivity possible. Among the Lakota, Orphan children become the responsibility of the entire band, Red Thunder explained. No one person can claim them as property to be sold or traded. What your people allow to happen to those without family is difficult for us to understand. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, we crested a low hill and I got my first view of the Lakota camp spread out in the valley below. It was far larger than I had expected, perhaps 60 lodges, arranged in a loose circle around a central area where cook fires sent thin columns of smoke into the clear air. Children played between the teepees while women worked at various tasks, their voices carrying faintly on the wind. "My people," Red Thunder said simply, and I could hear the pride and affection in his voice. As we descended toward the camp, people began to emerge from their lodges to watch our approach. Word of our mission had apparently preceded us, because the expressions I saw were curious rather than hostile. Several women pointed at me and spoke rapidly to each other in Lakota, their tone suggesting excitement rather than alarm. An elderly woman with silver-gray hair and deeply lined features approached us as Red Thunder brought his stallion to a halt near the largest lodge in the camp. She spoke rapidly in Lakota, her eyes never leaving my face as Red Thunder responded. I couldn't understand the words, but her tone suggested both concern and welcome. "This is Grandmother Willow," Red Thunder told me as he helped me down from his horse. "She is the medicine woman of our band and the wisest among us. She will care for you while you heal." Grandmother Willow examined me with eyes that seemed to see everything: the infected wounds on my ankles, the bruises that still marked my arms and face, the way I favored my left side where Charlie had struck me with his rifle butt during one of my escape attempts. She spoke again to Red Thunder, her voice carrying an unmistakable note of anger. "She says the men who did this to you were not men at all, but demons in human form," Red Thunder translated. "She asks if you would like her to curse their spirits so they cannot find peace in the afterlife." The offer was so unexpected that I almost laughed, despite everything I had been through. "Thank you, but I think justice has already been served," I replied, thinking of Dutch and his men. Grandmother Willow seemed to understand my words without translation, nodding approvingly before taking my arm and guiding me toward her lodge. As we walked, I became aware of the dozens of people watching our progress with undisguised curiosity. Children peered around their mothers' skirts to get a better look at me, while young warriors whispered among themselves about the rescue that had brought me here. The interior of Grandmother Willow's lodge was larger and more comfortable than I had expected. Buffalo robes covered the ground, and various pouches and bundles hung from the lodge poles, filling the air with the scent of sage and other herbs I couldn't identify. A small fire burned in the center, its smoke rising through the opening at the top. Without ceremony, Grandmother Willow began examining my injuries more thoroughly, her hands gentle but thorough as she assessed the damage inflicted by 3 weeks of captivity. She spoke continuously in Lakota, not to me but apparently to herself, as if cataloging each wound and deciding on the appropriate treatment. From one of her medicine bundles, she produced a clay pot containing what appeared to be a thick, dark salve. The smell was pungent, but not unpleasant, reminiscent of pine sap, mixed with something sharper that made my eyes water slightly. She began applying it to the wounds on my ankles, and almost immediately I felt a cooling sensation that seemed to draw the heat and pain from the infected areas. As she worked, other women began arriving at the lodge entrance, each bringing something different: clean clothing, food, blankets, or simply their presence as a show of support. I was overwhelmed by this outpouring of kindness from people who had no reason to care about my welfare beyond basic human decency. One young woman, perhaps a few years older than myself, approached with what appeared to be a complete outfit of traditional Lakota women's clothing. She spoke to Grandmother Willow, who nodded and gestured for the woman to come closer. "This is Morning Star," Red Thunder said, appearing in the lodge entrance. She offers you clothing more suitable than what you wear now. Looking down at my torn and filthy dress, I realized how inappropriate my appearance must seem in this clean, orderly environment. I would be grateful, I said to Morning Star, who smiled and began laying out the garments she had brought. The outfit consisted of a long dress made from soft, butter-colored buckskin, decorated with intricate beadwork in blue and white patterns. There were matching leggings, moccasins that looked like they would fit perfectly, and a belt made from braided leather and decorated with small silver discs that caught the firelight. Morning Star made these for her younger sister who died of the spotted sickness last winter, Red Thunder explained quietly. She says the clothes should be worn by someone who will honor her sister's memory. The generosity overwhelmed me. These people had welcomed me into their community, provided medical care for my injuries, and now were offering me clothing that clearly represented significant work and emotional investment. I felt tears welling up in my eyes for the first time since my rescue. Please tell her I'm honored, I managed to say, and that I'll do my best to be worthy of such kindness. Red Thunder translated my words, and Morning Star's smile grew even brighter. She said something in response that made several of the other women laugh, though not unkindly. She says you already honor the clothes by surviving when evil men want you to die, Red Thunder told me. She says courage looks good in any color. As evening approached and the women gradually departed to tend to their own families, I found myself alone with Grandmother Willow and Red Thunder. The medicine woman had finished treating my wounds and was preparing some kind of tea from dried herbs, the steam rising from her small pot filling the lodge with a pleasant, soothing aroma. Tomorrow you will meet Standing Bear, Red Thunder informed me as I gratefully accepted a cup of herbal tea. He will want to hear your story and decide what is to be done. What do you mean, what is to be done? I asked, suddenly worried that my welcome here might be more temporary than I had hoped. Red Thunder seemed to understand my concern. Do not fear. You are under our protection now. But Standing Bear must decide whether you wish to return to your own people, or if you would prefer to remain among the Lakota. Either choice will be honored. The question caught me off guard. In all the chaos of rescue and recovery, I hadn't really considered what would happen next. Return to what? I had no family, no home, no life waiting for me back in Kansas City. The boarding house where I had lived would have rented my room to someone else weeks ago. My few possessions were probably long gone, but staying among the Lakota? The idea was both appealing and terrifying. These people had shown me more kindness in one day than I had experienced in months, but I was still a white woman in an Indian camp, dependent on their continued goodwill for my very survival. I don't know what I want, I admitted honestly. I need time to think. Wisdom often requires time, Red Thunder agreed. Rest now. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges and its own opportunities. As I settled onto the soft buffalo robes that Grandmother Willow had arranged for my bed, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation my life had undergone in a single day. This morning I had been a chained captive, facing the future of brutalization and despair. Tonight I was a welcomed guest in a Lakota lodge, treated with respect and care by people who had risked their lives to save a stranger. The change was so dramatic that part of me wondered if I was dreaming, if the trauma of captivity had finally broken my mind and I was imagining this entire experience. But the gentle warmth of the fire, the soft comfort of the robes, and the lingering taste of Grandmother Willow's healing tea all felt undeniably real. For the first time in weeks, I fell asleep without fear, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a peaceful camp and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new possibilities rather than continued suffering. I woke to the sound of children's laughter and the gentle morning activities of the camp coming to life around me. For a moment, disorientation clouded my thoughts as I struggled to remember where I was. The soft buffalo robes beneath me, the herbal scents lingering in the air, the absence of iron chains around my ankles, it all seemed too good to be real. Grandmother Willow was already awake, tending a small fire and preparing what smelled like some kind of breakfast porridge. She smiled when she saw me stirring and said something in Lakota that sounded welcoming, though I couldn't understand the words. Her tone, however, conveyed warmth and the kind of motherly concern I hadn't experienced since my own mother's death. "She says you slept peacefully." Red Thunder's voice came from the lodge entrance. "No crying out, no thrashing. She takes this as a good sign that your spirit is beginning to heal along with your body." I sat up carefully, testing my strength and finding it marginally improved from the day before. The infected wounds on my ankles felt better thanks to Grandmother Willow's medicine, and the constant ache that had plagued my back from weeks of lying on the hard wagon floor had diminished considerably. "I feel better," I admitted, accepting a bowl of the warm porridge from Grandmother Willow. It tasted of corn and wild berries, with a hint of honey that made it surprisingly pleasant. "When do I meet Standing Bear?" "This morning," Red Thunder replied, settling cross-legged beside the fire. "But first, there are things you should understand about our ways, about what will be expected of you during the council." Over the next hour, as the camp fully awakened around us, Red Thunder explained the protocols I would need to follow when meeting with Standing Bear and the other band leaders. The Lakota had formal procedures for virtually every aspect of tribal life, from the arrangement of seating in council meetings to the proper way to address elders and warriors of different status. "You will sit where I indicate," he instructed. "Speak only when directly addressed, and answer questions honestly and completely. Standing Bear values truth above all else, even when that truth might be uncomfortable to hear." I learned that my presence in the camp had already become a matter of some debate among the tribal leaders. While my rescue had been universally supported, my continued presence raised complex questions about the band's relationship with white authorities, the potential for military retaliation, and the practical challenges of integrating someone from such a different cultural background into their community. "Some believe you should be taken to Fort Mitchell and turned over to the Army," Red Thunder explained. "They fear that keeping you here will bring soldiers looking for you, endangering the entire band." "And others?" "Others believe that the spirits brought you to us for a reason, that turning you away would anger the powers that guide our people." He paused, studying my face carefully. "What do you believe, Rebecca Morrison?" The question caught me off guard. In all my years as an orphan making my own way in Kansas City, no one had ever asked me what I believed about the greater forces that shaped human destiny. My life had been focused on immediate survival, earning enough money for rent and food, avoiding the attention of men who might take advantage of a young woman living alone, and planning for a future that seemed both distant and uncertain. "Believe your people saved my life," I said finally. "Whether that was the work of spirits or simple human decency, I'm grateful beyond words. But I don't want my presence to bring harm to those who helped me." Red Thunder nodded approvingly. "Wise words. Standing Bear will want to hear such thoughts from you directly." After breakfast, Morning Star arrived with several other young women, all chattering excitedly in Lakota as they examined the clothes she had given me the night before. With gentle insistence and much giggling, they helped me dress in the traditional outfit, adjusting the fit and teaching me how to properly wear the various accessories. The transformation was remarkable. Looking at my reflection in a polished metal mirror that one of the women produced, I barely recognized myself. The soft buckskin dress fit perfectly, the intricate beadwork catching the morning light. The moccasins were more comfortable than any shoes I had ever worn, and the braided leather belt emphasized a waist that weeks of near starvation had made more slender than nature intended. More importantly, I felt different. The heavy, restrictive clothing of my former life had been replaced by garments that allowed freedom of movement, that seemed designed for an active life rather than one constrained by social expectations. For the first time since my parents' death, I looked in a mirror and saw someone who might have control over her own destiny. "You look like one of us now," Morning Star said in careful English, her pronunciation suggesting she had been practicing the words. "Beautiful," the compliment, delivered with such obvious sincerity, brought tears to my eyes. After weeks of being treated as nothing more than cargo, the simple recognition of my humanity felt overwhelming. Red Thunder returned, as the women were putting the finishing touches on my appearance. His expression when he saw me was unreadable, but something shifted in his eyes that suggested approval, or perhaps something deeper. "The council is ready," he announced. "Remember what I have taught you about our ways." The council lodge was the largest structure in the camp, capable of holding perhaps 30 people around its central fire. When we entered, I saw that about half that number were already seated in what appeared to be a carefully arranged hierarchy. Standing Bear occupied the position of honor directly across from the entrance, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was older than I had expected, perhaps in his 50s, with silver streaking his long black hair and deep lines marking his weathered face. But his eyes were sharp and intelligent, and when they fixed on me, I felt as though he was seeing not just my appearance, but something deeper about my character and motivations. Red Thunder guided me to a position near the fire, but slightly to one side, where I could see all the council members, but was clearly identified as a guest rather than a participant. The other attendees included several men I recognized from the rescue party, along with others who had the bearing of experienced warriors and tribal leaders. "Rebecca Morrison," Standing Bear said in English that was even more precise than Red Thunder's, "you are welcome in our lodge. We have heard the story of your rescue, but we would hear your own words about the events that brought you to our territory." For the next hour, I recounted my story in detail, beginning with my parents' death and my life in Kansas City, through Dutch Morrison's arrival with his forged papers, the 3 weeks of captivity, and finally the confrontation at the creek crossing. The council listened in complete silence, their faces revealing nothing of their thoughts or reactions. When I finished, Standing Bear asked several pointed questions about my family background, my skills and abilities, and my understanding of what life among the Lakota would entail. His queries were respectful but thorough, clearly designed to assess not just my immediate needs, but my potential long-term value to the community. "You have suffered greatly at the hands of evil men," he said finally. "But suffering alone does not determine a person's place in the world. What can you offer our people in return for the protection and care we would provide?" The question was fair, and I had been expecting it. "I can work," I replied. "I'm skilled with needle and thread. I supported myself as a seamstress before. My capture. I can mend clothing, create new garments, and teach those skills to others if desired. I'm willing to learn whatever other tasks would be useful." An older woman seated near Standing Bear spoke up in Lakota, her tone suggesting a question or perhaps a challenge. Standing Bear nodded and translated for my benefit. "Singing Crane asks whether you would be content to live as our women live, without the comforts and conveniences of white settlements. She points out that choosing to remain among us means accepting our ways completely, not just when it suits you." The implication was clear. This wouldn't be a temporary arrangement or a casual cultural exchange. If I chose to stay, I would be committing to becoming Lakota in every meaningful sense, abandoning my former identity and the possibility of returning to white society. "I understand," I said, meeting Singing Crane's skeptical gaze directly. "And yes, I believe I could be content with such a life. The comforts of white civilization didn't protect me from being kidnapped and sold like livestock. Your people freed me when my own kind had abandoned me to my fate." Another council member, a younger man with the bearing of a war leader, asked something that prompted a brief but intense discussion among the assembled leaders. Red Thunder leaned close to whisper a translation. "Crowfeather argues that keeping you here is too dangerous, that white authorities will eventually come looking, and our entire band could be punished for harboring you. Others disagree, saying that turning away someone under our protection would bring worse consequences from the spirits. Standing Bear raised his hand for silence, and the debate immediately ceased. He studied me for a long moment before speaking again. "There is another consideration," he said slowly. "Word has already spread to other bands about your rescue. Some see it as proof that we are strong enough to defend the innocent against evil. Others worry that it signals we are becoming too involved in white conflicts." I began to understand the broader implications of my situation. My rescue had been more than a simple act of charity. It had been a political statement about Lakota values and capabilities that resonated far beyond this single band. "If I were to leave," I asked carefully, "would that resolve the concerns about my presence here?" "Perhaps," Standing Bear admitted. "But it would also send a different message, that we rescue people only to abandon them when it becomes inconvenient. Such an action would diminish our honor." The discussion continued for another hour, with various council members expressing their viewpoints in rapid Lakota, while I sat quietly and tried to follow the emotional currents of the debate. It became clear that this wasn't simply a decision about my personal fate, but a defining moment for the band's relationship with the changing world around them. Finally, Standing Bear called for silence again and turned his attention back to me. "Rebecca Morrison, we offer you a choice," he said formally. "You may remain among us and become one of our people in truth, learning our ways and accepting our protection. Or we will escort you safely to Fort Mitchell, where you can make your own arrangements for returning to white society." "But," he continued, raising a hand to forestall my immediate response, "if you choose to stay, you must understand that there is no going back. The white world will consider you lost or dead. You will be Lakota with all the dangers and responsibilities that entails." The choice was exactly what I had been expecting, but having it laid out so starkly still felt overwhelming. Stay and commit completely to a life among people whose culture I barely understood, or leave and face an uncertain future among the very society that had failed to protect me from Dutch Morrison's predations. How long do I have to decide? I asked. 3 days, Standing Bear replied. "Use that time to observe our ways, to speak with our women about what your life would be like, to understand fully what you would be choosing." As the council dispersed, Red Thunder approached me with an expression that suggested he had his own thoughts about my decision. "Come," he said. "There are people you should meet, things you should see, before you choose your path." Over the next 3 days, I was given an intensive introduction to Lakota life that went far beyond the kindness I had already experienced. I worked alongside the women in their daily tasks, preparing food, tanning hides, gathering medicinal plants, caring for children. I watched the men practice with weapons and horses, observed the complex social dynamics that governed relationships within the band, and gradually began to understand the deep spiritual beliefs that guided every aspect of Lakota culture. Most importantly, I spent hours in conversation with Red Thunder, learning about his own background and the events that had shaped his worldview. He had been educated at a mission school as a young man, giving him his fluency in English and an understanding of white culture that made him valuable as an intermediary between worlds. "I chose to return to my people," he told me as we sat beside a small stream on the second evening. "The white teachers wanted me to become like them, to abandon everything that made me Lakota. But I learned that a man can take knowledge from anywhere without losing his soul." "Is that what you think I should do?" I asked. "Stay and try to bridge 2 worlds?" He was quiet for a long time, watching the water flow past our feet. "I think you should choose the world where you can be most truly yourself," he said finally. "Where you can grow into the person the spirits meant you to become." By the 3rd day, my decision was clear. That evening, I approached Standing Bear. and formally requested permission to remain among his people, to become Lakota in all the ways that mattered. "Then it is settled," he said with satisfaction. "Tomorrow we will hold the ceremony to welcome you fully into our band. But first, there are preparations to be made, rituals to be observed." As I lay down that night for what I knew would be my last sleep as Rebecca Morrison, I felt a profound sense of rightness about the choice I had made. The woman who would wake tomorrow would still carry my memories and experiences, but she would be someone new, someone with a place in the world and people who valued her presence. The transformation that had begun with my rescue was about to be completed, and I looked forward to discovering who I would become. The ceremony that transformed me from Rebecca Morrison into Whitebird Woman was unlike anything I could have imagined. As dawn broke over the camp, I was led by the women to a secluded grove beside a meandering creek where ancient cottonwoods provided shelter from prying eyes. The ritual that followed lasted most of the day, involving purification ceremonies, the burning of sage and sweetgrass, and prayers spoken in Lakota that I felt in my bones even though I couldn't understand the words. Grandmother Willow painted my face with sacred symbols using pigments made from ochre and charcoal, each mark carrying spiritual significance that she explained through Red Thunder's translation. The design represented rebirth, protection, and the wings of the white crane that had appeared in Standing Bear's vision the night before my rescue, hence my new name. When we returned to the camp as the sun reached its zenith, I was no longer the same person who had awakened that morning. The transformation was complete, not just in name but in something deeper, a fundamental shift in how I saw myself and my place in the world. I belonged here now, bound to these people by choice and ceremony rather than mere circumstance. But belonging, I soon discovered, came with responsibilities and challenges I hadn't fully anticipated. The first test came just 3 days after my naming ceremony, when runners arrived from the east with disturbing news. A cavalry patrol from Fort Robinson had been asking questions in settlements throughout the territory, specifically inquiring about a missing white woman believed to have been taken by hostile Indians. "They have a description that matches you," Red Thunder told me grimly as the band's leaders gathered in the emergency council. "Blonde hair, slight build, age of perhaps 20. They claim you were kidnapped from a merchant caravan and offer a reward for information leading to your recovery." I felt cold dread settling in my stomach. Dutch's friend Blake, the one who escaped. He must have reported a version of events that makes me look like a victim of Indian raids rather than someone rescued from slavers. Standing Bear nodded gravely. "This Blake has turned truth on its head, making his companions appear as legitimate merchants and us as the criminals. The army now believes they have justification to search our territory." The implications were staggering. If cavalry patrols found me in the Lakota camp, it would confirm their suspicions that I had been kidnapped by Indians. The fact that I had chosen to stay, that I had been rescued rather than captured, would be dismissed as either coercion or the ravings of a woman driven mad by her ordeal. "What are our options?" asked Crow Feather, the war leader who had argued against keeping me. "From the beginning, we could move the entire band deeper into the hills," suggested one of the older council members. "Take the winter camp early and avoid contact with the soldiers entirely." Standing Bear shook his head. "That would mean abandoning the late season buffalo hunt, leaving us short of meat and hides for the cold months. And it would confirm military suspicions that we have something to hide." "Or we could turn her over to them," Crow Feather said bluntly, his eyes fixed on me. "Explain that we found her wandering alone and cared for her until authorities could claim her." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. I understood Crow Feather's logic. Sacrificing one person to protect the entire band was a reasonable strategy from a purely tactical standpoint. But the idea of being handed back to white authorities, of trying to explain my voluntary transformation into a Lakota woman, filled me with a terror that surprised me with its intensity. That course brings its own dangers, Red Thunder pointed out. White Bird Woman now knows our camp's location, our numbers, our defenses. If they take her, they will question her thoroughly about everything she has observed. I realized he was right. In the week since my rescue, I had learned more about Lakota military capabilities and strategies than any white captive should reasonably know. I had observed their weapons caches, their scouting methods, their plans for winter camps in spring. Raids, in the hands of army interrogators, such information could prove devastating to the band's security. There is another way, I said quietly, surprising myself by speaking up in the middle of a war council. All eyes turned to me, some disapproving of my interruption, others curious about what I might suggest. Standing Bear gestured for me to continue. Speak your thoughts, White Bird Woman. What if the cavalry patrol never finds any trace of the woman they're looking for? I asked. What if Rebecca Morrison simply disappeared without a trace, leaving no trail for them to follow? Red Thunder frowned, not immediately understanding my meaning. You speak in riddles. I'm suggesting we give them a trail that leads nowhere. I explained, the plan forming in my mind as I spoke. Leave evidence that Rebecca Morrison died in the wilderness, far from here. A grave marker, some personal belongings, perhaps signs of a wild animal attack. If the army believes she's dead, they'll stop searching. The idea sparked immediate debate among the council members. Some saw merit in the deception. Others worried about the spiritual implications of staging a false death. But it was singing. Crane, the elder woman who had initially questioned my commitment, who raised the most practical concern. What personal belongings? She asked sharply. The clothes you wore when rescued were burned as ceremonially unclean. What proof of death? Could we provide that soldiers would believe? I reached up and touched the simple locket I wore around my neck, the only possession I had managed to keep throughout my ordeal. It contained a small photograph of my parents, and was the one item that could definitively identify Rebecca Morrison. This, I said, removing the locket and holding it out for the council to see. It's the only thing that proves Rebecca Morrison ever existed. If they find it beside a makeshift grave, they'll have no reason to search further. The sacrifice felt enormous. The locket was my last connection to my former life, the only tangible reminder of my parents and the woman I had been before my transformation. But I also recognized it as the key to securing my new life among the Lakota. Standing, Bear studied the locket carefully before passing it around the circle of council members. When it returned to him, he held it up to catch the firelight. Would you give up this memory of your blood family to protect your chosen family? He asked. Yes, I replied without hesitation. My parents are dead. They live in my heart now, not in a piece of metal and glass. But the people in this camp are alive, and they're in danger because of me. The decision was made that very night. Red Thunder would lead a small party east toward the area where Dutch's company had been intercepted, carrying the locket and a few other items that could plausibly have belonged to a captured woman. They would create a burial site that appeared authentic but not recent, suggesting that Rebecca Morrison had died weeks earlier from injury or exposure. But as dawn approached and Red Thunder's party prepared to depart, new complications arose. Black Hawk, the young warrior who had shown such interest in my welfare, approached the group with disturbing information. Soldiers are closer than we thought, he reported breathlessly, having ridden through the night to bring word. I saw their campfires yesterday evening, perhaps 2 days' ride from here. They are moving in our direction. This changed everything. Instead of having several days to plant evidence at a distant location, Red Thunder's party would need to work quickly, and much closer to the band's camp. Worse, they risked encountering the cavalry patrol while attempting to carry out their deception. I should go with them, I declared, the words coming out before I had fully thought them through. If there's any chance of running into soldiers, you'll need someone who can speak for the group in English. Red Thunder immediately shook his head. Too dangerous. If you are seen and recognized, the entire plan fails. And if your party is discovered planting fake evidence, the results will be even worse, I countered. You'll be caught in an obvious deception that could be interpreted as an act of war. The argument that followed was intense but brief. Time was running short, and practical considerations ultimately overruled emotional ones. I would accompany Red Thunder's party, but disguised so thoroughly that even close inspection wouldn't reveal my identity as the missing white woman. Grandmother Willow worked swiftly to alter my appearance using techniques I hadn't known existed. She darkened my skin with a mixture of plant dyes and clay, applied temporary tattoos using berry juice that would last for several days, and braided my hair with decorative elements that completely changed its texture and appearance. When she finished, even I barely recognized myself in her polished metal mirror. "You are not Whitebird Woman now," she said seriously. "You are Laughing Water, daughter of the Minican Jew, visiting our band to select a husband. If questioned, you speak only Lakota and understand nothing of English." The transformation was so complete that when Red Thunder saw me, he actually started in surprise before recognizing who I was. "Grandmother Willow's medicine is strong," he said with grudging admiration. "Your own mother would not know you now." Our party departed before full sunrise, riding hard toward the east where intelligence suggested the cavalry patrol was most likely to encounter our false trail. In addition to Red Thunder and myself, the group included Black Hawk and 2 other young warriors chosen for their speed and stealth rather than their fighting ability. We rode through terrain that was beautiful but treacherous, crossing creek beds and navigating around prairie dog towns while maintaining a pace that covered significant ground without exhausting our horses. Red Thunder was an expert at reading the landscape, choosing routes that would be difficult to track while still allowing rapid movement. By midday, we had reached the area where he planned to create our deception. It was a small creek bordered by stands of willows and cottonwoods, the kind of place where a wounded or exhausted person might realistically have sought shelter before succumbing to their injuries. Red Thunder had brought props for our false burial site, torn pieces of cloth that could have come from a woman's dress, a broken comb, and a few other personal items that suggested tragedy without being too obvious about it. Most importantly, he carried my locket, which would serve as the definitive proof of Rebecca Morrison's death. "We must work quickly," he said as we dismounted and began preparing the site. "And be ready to abandon everything if soldiers appear." Unexpectedly, the work was more complex than I had anticipated. The burial mound had to look realistic but not recent, weathered by weeks of exposure to wind and rain. The personal belongings needed to be scattered in a pattern that suggested scavenging by animals rather than careful placement by human hands. Black Hawk, serving as a lookout from a nearby rise, signaled the approach of riders while we were still arranging the final details of our deception. My heart raced as I saw him make the hand gestures that indicated multiple horses moving from the south, the direction from which a cavalry patrol would most likely approach. "Hide the horses," Red Thunder ordered tersely. "Everyone takes concealment positions, and remember, if we are discovered, we are simply young people out gathering medicinal plants for our elders." The next few minutes stretched like hours as we waited in tense silence among the willows. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew steadily louder, accompanied by the distinctive jingle of military equipment and the occasional voice speaking in English. Through gaps in the vegetation, I caught my first glimpse of the patrol, 8 cavalry troopers led by a sergeant, whose weathered face spoke of years on the frontier. They rode with the casual alertness of professional soldiers, their eyes constantly scanning the terrain for signs of danger or anything unusual. They passed within 50 yards of our hiding place without stopping, apparently seeing nothing to arouse their suspicions. But just as I began to hope they would continue on their way, the sergeant raised his hand and called a halt. "Something here doesn't look right," he announced in a voice that carried clearly across the water. "Johnson. Daniels, check out that stand of trees. Could be a camp or cache." My blood turned to ice as two troopers dismounted and began walking directly toward our concealed burial site. There was no way they could miss finding the evidence we had so carefully planted. No way to retreat without being seen. Red Thunder met my eyes and nodded almost imperceptibly. Our deception was about to be tested under the most challenging circumstances possible. Direct discovery by the very people it was designed to fool. The soldiers approached the fake burial site with weapons ready, clearly suspicious of any disturbance in what should have been empty wilderness. When the first trooper spotted the scattered belongings, he called out to his sergeant, "Got something here, Sarge. Looks like someone made camp here a while back. Lot of stuff scattered around." The sergeant dismounted and strode over to examine the discovery, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of what we had created. I held my breath as he picked up the broken comb, studied the torn fabric, and finally spotted the glint of my locket half buried in the artificial grave mound. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, brushing dirt away from the locket and opening it to reveal the photograph inside. "Looks like we found what we came looking for, boys. Question is, what happened to the rest of her?" As the sergeant and his men began a more thorough examination of the site, looking for additional clues about Rebecca Morrison's fate, I realized our deception had succeeded better than we had dared hope. They were completely convinced they had found evidence of the missing woman's death, with no suspicion that the very person they sought was watching them from less than 100 yards away. But our success came with an unexpected complication. The soldiers were settling in to conduct a detailed investigation of the site, setting up a temporary camp that would keep them in the area for hours or possibly days. We were trapped in our hiding place, unable to retreat without being spotted, forced to remain motionless while cavalry troopers searched for additional evidence, just beyond the screen of willows that concealed us. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, and the soldiers showed no signs of departing, I began to realize that our carefully planned deception had created a new and potentially more dangerous problem than the one it was meant to solve. Hours passed like days as we remained frozen in our hiding place among the willows. The cavalry patrol had made camp barely a stone's throw from where we lay concealed, their voices carrying clearly across the small creek as they discussed their discovery and debated what it meant for their mission. "Looks like she's been dead for weeks," I heard the sergeant tell his men as they examined my locket more thoroughly. "Probably got separated from her party during an Indian attack, wandered out here, and died of exposure or wounds. What about the reward?" asked one of the younger soldiers. "We found evidence of the missing woman, even if we didn't find her alive." "That's for the brass to decide," the sergeant replied. "But I'd say our job here is done. Dead women don't need rescuing." Despite the success of our deception, I felt no relief. The soldiers were clearly preparing to remain in the area overnight, setting up a proper camp with sentries and a picket line for their horses. Worse, they had positioned themselves between us and the most direct route back to the Lakota camp, making escape significantly more dangerous. Red Thunder had been monitoring the situation through careful observation, occasionally using hand signals to communicate with Black Hawk and the other warriors about the soldiers' movements and preparations. As the sun began to set, he made his way through the thick underbrush to where I was concealed. "We cannot remain here much longer," he whispered barely audibly. "When they post night sentries, any movement will be detected. What are options?" I asked, my voice no louder than breathing. "Wait until very late, when the guards are drowsy, then attempt to slip away in darkness. Or create a distraction that draws their attention while we escape in a different direction." Neither option seemed particularly appealing. The cavalry patrol consisted of experienced frontier soldiers who would be alert to exactly the kind of tactics Red Thunder was describing. Any mistake would result in discovery, capture, and the complete exposure of our deception. But as we debated our limited choices, a new complication arose that changed everything. From the north came the sound of approaching horses, not the measured pace of a patrol, but the urgent rhythm of riders moving fast with news to deliver. "Sergeant Miller," a voice called out as the new arrivals entered the soldiers' camp. "Orders from Colonel Bradley at Fort Robinson." Through the screen of vegetation, I watched as two mounted couriers dismounted and approached the sergeants. Fire! One of them carried a leather dispatch case that clearly contained official communications, while the other led a pack horse loaded with additional supplies. "What's the word from the fort?" Sergeant Miller asked, accepting the dispatches. "Change of mission," the lead courier replied. "Intelligence reports suggest a large Lakota war party is gathering in the Black Hills, possibly planning coordinated attacks on settlements. All patrols are ordered to abandon current assignments and concentrate at Bear Creek for a major sweep operation." My blood ran cold. A major military operation meant hundreds of soldiers converging on Lakota territory, including the area where Standing Bear's band was camped. Our successful deception about my death had solved one problem, only to reveal a much larger and more dangerous threat. Sergeant Miller read through the dispatches by firelight, while his men gathered around to hear the new orders. "Says here they want every available man for this operation. Expected to last 2 weeks, maybe more. What about the missing woman?" asked one of the troopers. Miller held up my locket. "We found what we're going to find. I'll report that Rebecca Morrison died in the wilderness weeks ago. Case closed. Our priority now is this war party intelligence." As the soldiers began breaking camp in preparation for an immediate departure, I realized we were facing a crisis that went far beyond our current predicament. The military was preparing for what sounded like a coordinated campaign against all Lakota bands in the region. Not just small patrol actions, but a full-scale offensive designed to force the tribes onto reservations permanently. Red Thunder had clearly reached the same conclusion. His expression was grim as he watched the cavalry prepare to leave, understanding that their departure would free us to return to camp, but also knowing that we would be carrying news that could determine the fate of our entire people. "We must reach Standing Bear immediately," he whispered. "This changes everything." The soldiers departed within an hour, riding north toward their rendezvous point and leaving behind only the cold ashes of their fire and the disturbed earth where they had discovered our false burial site. We waited another hour to ensure they were truly gone before emerging from our concealment, stiff and cramped from hours of motionless hiding. "How much do they know?" Black Hawk asked as we retrieved our horses from their hiding place deeper in the woods. "Enough to be dangerous," Red Thunder replied grimly. "Someone has been providing intelligence about Lakota movements, probably traders or settlers who monitor our activities and report to the army." We rode through the night, pushing our horses harder than was wise, but driven by the urgency of the information we carried. The landscape that had seemed beautiful during our eastward journey now felt ominous and threatening, every shadow potentially concealing scouts or advanced elements of the military force gathering against us. By dawn, we had covered most of the distance back to the camp, but our horses were exhausted and we were forced to rest them beside a small stream. It was during this brief halt that we encountered the first sign that our warnings might already be too late. Black Hawk, who had climbed a nearby rise to scan for pursuit, came racing back with news that made my heart sink. "Smoke," he reported. Tersely, multiple columns from the direction of our camp. We mounted immediately despite our horses' fatigue, covering the remaining distance in a desperate ride that confirmed our worst fears. The Lakota camp was gone, not abandoned, but destroyed. Several lodges had been burned, and the ground was torn up by the hooves of many horses moving in formation. But there were no bodies, no signs of a massacre. Instead, We found evidence of a hasty but organized evacuation. Drag marks where lodge poles had been pulled away. Scattered belongings. That suggested people packing quickly rather than fleeing in panic. They had a warning, Red Thunder said with relief evident in his voice. Someone got word to them in time. A closer examination of the site revealed the answer. In a protected spot beneath an overhanging rock, we found a message left in the traditional Lakota way, a combination of symbols carved into bark and arranged stones that told the story of what had happened. Runners came from the east before dawn, Red Thunder translated. Large cavalry force is approaching. Band moved to a winter refuge in the sacred canyon. Follow the marked trail, but beware of soldiers. The sacred canyon was a hidden valley. Deep in the Black Hills, a place known only to the Lakota and considered so holy that even enemies who discovered it were said to be cursed. It was also naturally defensible, with narrow entrances that could be easily guarded and water sources that would allow a prolonged siege, if necessary. But reaching it would require traveling through territory that was now crawling with military patrols, and doing so with exhausted horses and riders who had been awake for more than 24 hours. We rest here until midday, Red Thunder decided. Let the horses recover and scout the area before attempting to reach the canyon. As we made a cold camp in the ruins of what had been my home for the past weeks, I found myself reflecting on the strange twists of fate that had brought me to this moment. Less than a month ago, I had been a captive facing a lifetime of brutalization. Now I was a Lakota warrior's companion, carrying intelligence that might save her adopted people from military destruction. But our respite was short-lived. Before noon, Black Hawk spotted cavalry patrols moving through the valley below our position, clearly following the same trail we needed to use to reach the sacred canyon. The soldiers were systematically searching every possible hiding place, working their way methodically toward the hills where the band had taken refuge. They know where we're going, I realized with growing alarm. Someone has told them about the canyon. Red Thunder's face darkened with anger. Blake, he said simply, the man who escaped from your captors. He must have more knowledge of Lakota territory than we suspected. The implications were staggering. If the army knew about the sacred canyon, they could seal off its entrances and trap the entire band inside. What should have been an impregnable refuge could become a prison from which there would be no escape. We have to warn them, I said, knowing even as I spoke that reaching the canyon ahead of the military force would be nearly impossible. Yes, Red Thunder agreed. But not the way the soldiers expect. He outlined a desperate plan that would require splitting our small party and taking enormous risks. 2 of our warriors would continue toward the canyon using established trails, deliberately revealing themselves to cavalry patrols and leading them away from the most direct approach. Meanwhile, Red Thunder and I would attempt to reach the canyon by a more dangerous route that involved scaling cliff faces and traversing narrow ledges that horses couldn't navigate. The climb will be treacherous, he warned. And if we fall, no one will know what happened to us. If we don't try, everyone in that canyon could die, I replied. The risk is worth taking. We left our horses with the 2 warriors who would serve as decoys, taking only essential gear and weapons for what would essentially be a mountain climbing expedition. The route Red Thunder had chosen would take us up and over the highest peaks surrounding the sacred canyon, approaching from a direction so difficult that no military commander would consider it possible. The climb began before dawn, with Red Thunder leading the way up rock faces that seemed nearly vertical in the dim morning light. My hands were soon cut and bleeding from gripping sharp stone, and my legs trembled with exhaustion as we ascended higher and higher into the thin mountain air, but the physical challenges were nothing compared to the mental pressure of knowing that time was running out. Below us, cavalry patrols were converging on the canyon from multiple directions, while above us loomed cliff faces that would test the limits of human endurance. Halfway, up the most challenging section of the climb. Disaster nearly struck. A handhold that had seemed secure crumbled under my weight, sending me sliding backward toward a drop that would have meant certain death. Only Red Thunder's quick reflexes and incredible strength saved me, his powerful grip arresting my fall. Just inches from the edge. "We cannot afford such mistakes," he said grimly as he pulled me back to safety. "The rocks here are treacherous, weathered by countless seasons." As we resumed climbing, I began to understand why this route was considered impossible. The rock face was not only steep but unstable, with loose stones and crumbling ledges that made every step a calculated risk. Several times we were forced to backtrack when our chosen path proved impassable. Precious time lost as we searched for alternative routes. But finally, as the sun reached its zenith, we crested the final ridge and saw the sacred canyon spread out below us. The sight was breathtaking, a hidden valley perhaps 2 miles long and half a mile wide, surrounded by towering cliffs and accessible only through narrow passages that could be easily defended. More importantly, we could see the Lakota camp established in the center of the valley, with the lodges arranged in the traditional circle and smoke rising from cook fires. The band had successfully reached their refuge and appeared to be settling in for what might be a prolonged siege, but our relief was short-lived. Even as we watched, we could see cavalry units taking positions at both ends of the canyon, effectively sealing off the entrances and trapping the Lakota inside. The military force was larger than we had expected, perhaps 300 soldiers, with artillery pieces that could command the entire valley floor. "We're too late," I whispered, the words bitter in my mouth. Red Thunder studied the scene below with the eyes of an experienced warrior, assessing strengths and weaknesses, looking for opportunities that might not be obvious to a casual observer. "Not too late," he said finally, "but close. The soldiers have sealed the canyon, but they haven't attacked yet. That means they're waiting for something, probably orders from their commander or additional forces." "What difference does that make?" I asked. "It means we still have time to change the outcome," he replied. "But it will require doing something no one expects, something so dangerous that even thinking about it seems like madness." As he outlined his plan, I began to understand why Red Thunder was considered one of the most respected war leaders among the Lakota. What he proposed was indeed madness, a desperate gamble that could either save the trapped band or result in the deaths of everyone involved. But it was also the only chance we had, and as I looked down at the people who had become my family, gathered in the valley below, I knew we had to try. The greatest test of my new life was about to begin. Red Thunder's plan was audacious beyond belief. While 300 cavalry soldiers maintained their siege positions around the sacred canyon, he proposed that we descend into the valley at night, infiltrate the military camp, and create enough chaos to allow the trapped Lakota band to break through the encirclement. 2 people against 300? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as we watched the soldiers below establish their positions. "Not against," he corrected. "Among. They expect an attack from the canyon warriors. Charge in their lines in a desperate breakout attempt. They don't expect enemies to already be inside their perimeter." The strategy relied on stealth, surprise, and the kind of audacity that bordered on insanity. We would wait until the darkest hour before dawn, when sentries were at their least alert, then make our way down the cliff face using ropes Red Thunder would fashion from our clothing and equipment. Once inside the military perimeter, we would sabotage their artillery pieces, scatter their horses, and create enough confusion to convince the soldiers they were under attack from multiple directions. In the chaos that followed, Standing Bear and his warriors could launch a coordinated breakout that might succeed against disorganized opposition. "And if we're caught?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Then we die," Red Thunder said simply. "But our people might live. That is all that matters." As afternoon gave way to Evening, we used the remaining daylight to study the enemy positions and plan our infiltration route. The military camp was laid out with professional precision. Artillery pieces positioned to command the canyon entrances. Cavalry horses picketed in neat lines. Sentries posted at regular intervals around the perimeter. But professional precision could also mean predictability. The sentries walked established routes at measured intervals, their movements becoming routine. The artillery pieces were guarded, but not heavily, since no one expected an attack from outside the canyon. Most importantly, the soldiers' attention was focused inward, toward the trapped Lakota band, rather than outward toward potential threats from their rear. While we waited for darkness, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 months ago, I had been Rebecca Morrison, a seamstress living a quiet life in Kansas City. Now I was White Bird Woman, preparing to risk everything to save people who had become more precious to me than my own life. The transformation went beyond mere names or clothing. Something fundamental had changed in how I saw myself and the world around me. The woman chained in Dutch Morrison's wagon would never have contemplated scaling cliff faces in darkness or infiltrating a military camp. But that woman had died beside the creek where Red Thunder freed me from my shackles, replaced by someone stronger, braver, and more determined than I had ever imagined possible. "Are you afraid?" Red Thunder asked as we made final preparations for our descent. "Terrified," I admitted, "but not dying. I'm afraid of failing, of letting down the people who saved me." He nodded understandingly. Fear for others is the mark of a true warrior. Fear for oneself is merely self-preservation. As midnight approached, we began our descent into the valley using ropes improvised from torn clothing and strips of leather. The cliff face was treacherous in darkness, with loose rocks and hidden obstacles that threatened to send us plummeting to our deaths. But gradually, painstakingly, we made our way downward toward the valley floor. The most dangerous moment came when we reached the level of the military sentries. A guard passed within 20 feet of our position, his boots crunching on the rocky ground as he walked his prescribed route. We froze against the cliff face, barely breathing, until he disappeared around a bend in the canyon wall. Once on the valley floor, we moved like shadows through the sleeping camp. The soldiers had grown overconfident during their day-long siege, certain that the trapped Lakota posed no immediate threat. Most were sleeping soundly, with only the minimum number of sentries required by military protocol. Our first target was the artillery battery positioned to cover the canyon's main entrance. 3 cannons and a howitzer, all loaded and ready to fire at the first sign of a breakout attempt. But artillery pieces were useless without gunpowder, and Red Thunder had brought the means to solve that problem permanently. Working in silence, we used knives to cut the canvas covers protecting the powder charges, then scattered the contents to the wind. What couldn't be scattered, we contaminated with water from our canteens, rendering it useless for firing. The work was slow and nerve-wracking, with discovery meaning certain death. But gradually we neutralized the entire battery. Next came the cavalry horses, picketed in long lines near the center of the camp. These animals represented the military forces' mobility and pursuit capability. Without horses, the soldiers would be reduced to foot troops, unable to chase fleeing Lakota across the vast prairie. But scattering horses required more noise than disabling cannons, and we knew discovery was almost inevitable once we began cutting picket lines. Red Thunder had planned for this, carrying fire arrows that would create multiple points of chaos simultaneously. "When the horses break free, the camp will erupt," he warned. "Stay low, move fast, and make your way to the rendezvous point no matter what happens to me." The rendezvous point was a rocky outcropping near the canyon's secondary entrance, where we hoped to meet Standing Bear's warriors when they launched their breakout. Getting there alive would require crossing 300 yards of open ground, while the entire military camp responded to our sabotage. Red Thunder lit his first fire arrow and sent it streaking into a pile of hay near the picket lines. Almost immediately, horses began rearing and plunging as the smell of smoke reached them. He fired 2 more arrows in quick succession, creating additional points of panic among the animals. Then everything exploded into chaos. Horses broke free from their restraints and galloped through the camp, trampling tents and scattering equipment. Soldiers emerged from their bedrolls in confusion, shouting questions and contradictory orders as they tried to understand what was happening. Officers bellowed commands that couldn't be heard over the din of terrified animals and shouting men. In the midst of this pandemonium, Red Thunder and I began our desperate dash toward the rendezvous point. We stayed low and moved in short rushes, using the confusion to mask our movements as we crossed the open ground between us and safety. We had covered perhaps half the distance when a sentry finally spotted us. "Indians in the camp!" he screamed, raising his rifle and firing wildly in our direction. The shot went wide, but it focused attention on our position just as more soldiers began organizing a response to the chaos around them. Red Thunder pushed me behind a fallen log, just as a volley of shots rang out, bullets whistling overhead and splintering the wood that sheltered us. "Keep moving," he shouted over the gunfire. "Don't stop for anything." The final 100 yards to the rendezvous point became a running battle, with bullets kicking up dirt around our feet as we sprinted from cover to cover. I had never been under fire before, and the experience was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. Every step could be my last, but every step also brought us closer to completing our mission. We reached the rocky outcropping, just as Standing Bear's warriors launched their breakout from the canyon's main entrance. The sound of war cries echoed off the canyon walls as Lakota fighters charged toward the confused and disorganized soldiers, taking advantage of the chaos we had created. But our mission wasn't complete yet. The secondary entrance where we waited was still guarded by a squad of soldiers who hadn't been affected by the confusion in the main camp. These men were alert and ready, their rifles trained on the narrow passage where they expected an attack. "The families will come through here," Red Thunder said, breathing heavily from our desperate run. "The women and children, the elders who cannot fight. We must clear this position before they arrive." The squad guarding the entrance consisted of 8 soldiers positioned behind makeshift barricades. They had an excellent field of fire and could easily massacre any Lakota civilians attempting to escape through the passage. But they were also focused entirely on the canyon entrance, not expecting an attack from behind. Red Thunder and I approached their position using the same stealth tactics that had served us in the main camp. But this time, we weren't sabotaging equipment. We were preparing to fight for our lives and the lives of our people. The battle that followed was brief but vicious. Red Thunder's war club crushed the skull of the first sentry before the man could cry out, while my knife found the heart of the second guard in the same instant. But the other soldiers reacted quickly, and within seconds we were engaged in deadly hand-to-hand combat. I had never killed anyone before that night, never even imagined myself capable of such violence. But when a soldier raised his rifle toward the canyon entrance where I knew Lakota families would soon appear, something primal took over. My knife moved with deadly precision, finding gaps in his uniform that I somehow knew would prove fatal. The fight lasted perhaps 3 minutes, though. It felt like hours. When the last soldier fell, Red Thunder and I stood alone among the bodies, both wounded but alive. Blood ran from a gash on his forehead where a rifle butt had struck him, while my left arm hung useless from a bullet wound that burned like fire. But we had succeeded. The entrance was clear, and even as we tended our wounds, the first Lakota families began emerging from the canyon. Grandmother Willow was among them, supporting an elderly man while carrying a bundle that probably contained her most precious medicines. "White Bird Woman," she called out when she saw me, her face breaking into a smile despite the danger surrounding us. The spirits told me you would be here when we needed you most. The escape that followed was a masterpiece of coordination and courage. While Standing Bear's warriors engaged the main military force, families and non-combatants streamed through the cleared secondary entrance. Red Thunder and I served as guides, leading them away from the canyon toward predetermined gathering points where horses waited to carry them to safety. By dawn, the sacred canyon was empty except for the bodies of soldiers and the smoldering remains of their equipment. The Lakota band had vanished into the vast prairie, scattering in multiple directions to confuse pursuit before reuniting at a distant location, known only to themselves. Red Thunder and I were among the last to leave, ensuring that no one had been left behind in the confusion of the escape. As we mounted our horses and rode away from the scene of our triumph, I looked back one final time at the place where my new life had been tested in the crucible of battle. What happens now? I asked as we followed the trail of our people toward safety. Now we live, Red Thunder replied simply. We raise families, tell stories of this night to our children, and prepare for whatever challenges the future may bring. The future, as it turned out, held more than I could have imagined. Red Thunder and I were married by Standing Bear himself in a ceremony held beneath the stars 3 weeks after our escape from the canyon. The wedding feast lasted 3 days, with warriors from neighboring bands coming to honor the woman who had helped save their people. I bore Red Thunder 4 children over the following years, 2 sons who grew to be respected warriors and 2 daughters who inherited their mother's fierce spirit. Our family prospered during the turbulent decades that followed, adapting to the changing world while maintaining the core values that had drawn me to the Lakota in the first place. Blake, the man whose betrayal had nearly destroyed us all, was found dead 6 months later near Fort Robinson, apparently killed by persons unknown. No one claimed responsibility for his death, but few mourned his passing. Justice, it seemed, had found its own way of settling old accounts. The military never solved the mystery of how 300 soldiers had been defeated by a band of primitive Indians. Official reports blamed the failure on equipment malfunctions and tactical errors, unable to acknowledge that they had been outfought by people they considered inferior. As for Rebecca Morrison, she was declared officially dead, her case closed and forgotten by authorities who had more pressing concerns. On the frontier, in a way, they were right. That woman had indeed died, replaced by someone stronger, freer, and more complete than she had ever been. Standing here now, 50 years later, watching my great-grandchildren play in the dust of our reservation home, I sometimes marvel at the strange path that brought me to this life. The woman who was chained in a wagon as a punishment bride could never have imagined becoming the matriarch of a family, the keeper of traditions, the bridge between 2 worlds that seemed so irreconcilably different. But perhaps that was always my destiny, written in stars I was too young to read when my journey began. Perhaps every chain that bound me, every cruelty I endured, every moment of despair was preparing me for the moment when Red Thunder would storm into my life and carry me away to a future I never could have dreamed. The chains are long gone now, rusted away to nothing. But the freedom they taught me to value remains, passed down through generations of children who will never know what it means to be owned by another human being. That, perhaps, is the greatest victory of all, not just my own liberation, but the liberation of all those who came after, free to choose their own paths because someone before them had the courage to break the chains that would have bound them as well. The story ends as it began, with a woman and her choices. But this woman is no longer powerless, no longer afraid, no longer alone. She is White Bird Woman, and she soars free across the endless sky of possibility, carried on wings that no chain could ever bind. Red Thunder's plan was audacious beyond belief. While 300 cavalry soldiers maintained their siege positions around the sacred canyon, he proposed that we descend into the valley at night, infiltrate the military camp, and create enough Chaos to allow the trapped Lakota band to break through the encirclement. 2 people against 300? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as we watched the soldiers below establish their positions. Not against, he corrected. Among. They expect an attack from the canyon, warriors charging their lines in a desperate breakout attempt. They don't expect enemies to already be inside their perimeter. The strategy relied on stealth, surprise, and the kind of audacity that bordered on insanity. We would wait until the darkest hour before dawn, when sentries were at their least alert, then make our way down the cliff face using ropes Red Thunder would fashion from our clothing and equipment. Once inside the military perimeter, we would sabotage their artillery pieces, scatter their horses, and create enough confusion to convince the soldiers they were under attack from multiple directions. In the chaos that followed, Standing Bear and his warriors could launch a coordinated breakout that might succeed against disorganized opposition. And if we're caught? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Then we die, Red Thunder said simply. But our people might live. That is all that matters. As afternoon gave way to evening, we used the remaining daylight to study the enemy positions and plan our infiltration route. The military camp was laid out with professional precision. Artillery pieces positioned to command the canyon entrances, cavalry horses picketed in neat lines, sentries posted at regular intervals around the perimeter. But professional precision could also mean predictability. The sentries walked established routes at measured intervals, their movements becoming routine. The artillery pieces were guarded, but not heavily, since no one expected an attack from outside the canyon. Most importantly, the soldiers' attention was focused inward, toward the trapped Lakota band, rather than outward toward potential threats from their rear. While we waited for darkness, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 months ago, I had been Rebecca Morrison, a seamstress living a quiet life in Kansas City. Now I was White Bird Woman, preparing to risk everything to save people who had become more precious to me than my own life. The transformation went beyond mere names or clothing. Something fundamental had changed in how I saw myself and the world around me. The woman chained in Dutch Morrison's wagon would never have contemplated scaling cliff faces in darkness or infiltrating a military camp. But that woman had died beside the creek where Red Thunder freed me from my shackles, replaced by someone stronger, braver, and more determined than I had ever imagined possible. Are you afraid? Red Thunder asked as we made final preparations for our descent. Terrified, I admitted, but not dying. I'm afraid of failing, of letting down the people who saved me. He nodded understandingly. Fear for others is the mark of a true warrior. Fear for oneself is merely self-preservation. As midnight approached, we began our descent in the valley using ropes improvised from torn clothing and strips of leather. The cliff face was treacherous in darkness, with loose rocks and hidden obstacles that threatened to send us plummeting to our deaths. But gradually, painstakingly, we made our way downward toward the valley floor. The most dangerous moment came when we reached the level of the military sentries. A guard passed within 20 feet of our position, his boots crunching on the rocky ground as he walked his prescribed route. We froze against the cliff face, barely breathing, until he disappeared around a bend in the canyon wall. Once on the valley floor, we moved like shadows through the sleeping camp. The soldiers had grown overconfident during their day-long siege, certain that the trapped Lakota posed no immediate threat. Most were sleeping soundly, with only the minimum number of sentries required by military protocol. Our first target was the artillery battery positioned to cover the canyon's main entrance. 3 cannons and a howitzer, all loaded and ready to fire at the first sign of a breakout attempt. But artillery pieces were useless without gunpowder, and Red Thunder had brought the means to solve that problem permanently. Working in silence, we used knives to cut the canvas covers protecting the powder charges, then scattered the contents to the wind. What couldn't be scattered, we contaminated with water from our canteens, rendering it useless for firing. The work was slow and nerve-wracking, with discovery meaning certain death. But gradually we neutralized the entire battery. Next came the cavalry horses, picketed in long lines near the center of the camp. These animals represented the military forces' mobility and pursuit capability. Without horses, the soldiers would be reduced to foot troops, unable to chase fleeing Lakota across the vast prairie. But scattering horses required more noise than disabling cannons, and we knew discovery was almost inevitable once we began cutting picket lines. Red Thunder had planned for this, carrying fire arrows that would create multiple points of chaos simultaneously. When the horses break free, the camp will erupt, he warned. Stay low, move fast, and make your way to the rendezvous point, no matter what happens to me. The rendezvous point was a rocky outcropping near the canyon's secondary entrance, where we hoped to meet Standing Bear's warriors when they launched their breakout. Getting there alive would require crossing 300 yards of open ground, while the entire military camp responded to our sabotage. Red Thunder lit his first fire arrow and sent it streaking into a pile of hay near the picket lines. Almost immediately, horses began rearing and plunging as the smell of smoke reached them. He fired 2 more arrows in quick succession, creating additional points of panic among the animals. Then everything exploded into chaos. Horses broke free from their restraints and galloped through the camp, trampling tents and scattering equipment. Soldiers emerged from their bedrolls in confusion, shouting questions and contradictory orders as they tried to understand what was happening. Officers bellowed commands that couldn't be heard over the din of terrified animals and shouting men. In the midst of this pandemonium, Red Thunder and I began our desperate dash toward the rendezvous point. We stayed low and moved in short rushes, using the confusion to mask our movements as we crossed the open ground between us and safety. We had covered perhaps half the distance when a sentry finally spotted us. Indians in the camp, he screamed, raising his rifle and firing wildly in our direction. The shot went wide, but it focused attention on our position, just as more soldiers began organizing a response to the chaos around them. Red Thunder pushed me behind a fallen log, just as a volley of shots rang out, bullets whistling overhead and splintering the wood that sheltered us. "Keep moving," he shouted over the gunfire. "Don't stop for anything." The final 100 yards to the rendezvous point became a running battle, with bullets kicking up dirt around our feet as we sprinted from cover to cover. I had never been under fire before, and the experience was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. Every step could be my last, but every step also brought us closer to completing our mission. We reached the rocky outcropping, just as Standing Bear's warriors launched their breakout from the canyon's main entrance. The sound of war cries echoed off the canyon walls as Lakota fighters charged toward the confused and disorganized soldiers, taking advantage of the chaos we had created. But our mission wasn't complete yet. The secondary entrance where we waited was still guarded by a squad of soldiers who hadn't been affected by the confusion in the main camp. These men were alert and ready, their rifles trained on the narrow passage where they expected an attack. "The families will come through here," Red Thunder said, breathing heavily from our desperate run. "The women and children, the elders who cannot fight. We must clear this position before they arrive." The squad guarding the entrance consisted of 8 soldiers positioned behind makeshift barricades. They had an excellent field of fire and could easily massacre any Lakota civilians attempting to escape through the passage. But they were also focused entirely on the canyon entrance, not expecting an attack from behind. Red Thunder and I approached their position using the same stealth tactics that had served us in the main camp. But this time, we weren't sabotaging equipment. We were preparing to fight for our lives and the lives of our people. The battle that followed was brief but vicious. Red Thunder's war club crushed the skull of the first sentry before the man could cry out. while my knife found the heart of the second guard in the same instant. But the other soldiers reacted quickly, and within seconds we were engaged in deadly hand-to-hand combat. I had never killed anyone before that night, never even imagined myself capable of such violence. But when a soldier raised his rifle toward the canyon entrance where I knew Lakota families would soon appear, something primal took over. My knife moved with deadly precision, finding gaps in his uniform that I somehow knew would prove fatal. Fight lasted perhaps 3 minutes, though it felt like hours. When the last soldier fell, Red Thunder and I stood alone among the bodies, both wounded but alive. Blood ran from a gash on his forehead where a rifle butt had struck him, while my left arm hung useless from a bullet wound that burned like fire. But we had succeeded. The entrance was clear, and even as we tended our wounds, the first Lakota families began emerging from the canyon. Grandmother Willow was among them, supporting an elderly man while carrying a bundle that probably contained her most precious medicines. "White Bird Woman," she called out when she saw me, her face breaking into a smile despite the danger surrounding us. "The spirits told me you would be here when we needed you most." The escape that followed was a masterpiece of coordination and courage. While Standing Bear's warriors engaged the main military force, families and non-combatants streamed through the cleared secondary entrance. Red Thunder and I served as guides, leading them away from the canyon toward predetermined gathering points where horses waited to carry them to safety. By dawn, the sacred canyon was empty except for the bodies of soldiers and the smoldering remains of their equipment. The Lakota band had vanished into the vast prairie, scattering in multiple directions to confuse pursuit before reuniting at a distant location, known only to themselves. Red Thunder and I were among the last to leave, ensuring that no one had been left behind in the confusion of the escape. As we mounted our horses and rode away from the scene of our triumph, I looked back one final time at the place where my new life had been tested in the crucible of battle. "What happens now?" I asked as we followed the trail of our people toward safety. "Now we live," Red Thunder replied simply. "We raise families, tell stories of this night to our children, and prepare for whatever challenges the future may bring." The future, as it turned out, held more than I could have imagined. Red Thunder and I were married by Standing Bear himself in a ceremony held beneath the stars 3 weeks after our escape from the canyon. The wedding feast lasted 3 days, with warriors from neighboring bands coming to honor the woman who had helped save their people. I bore Red Thunder 4 children over the following years, 2 sons who grew to be respected warriors and 2 daughters who inherited their mother's fierce spirit. Our family prospered during the turbulent decades that followed, adapting to the changing world while maintaining the core values that had drawn me to the Lakota in the first place. Blake, the man whose betrayal had nearly destroyed us all, was found dead 6 months later near Fort Robinson, apparently killed by persons unknown. No one claimed responsibility for his death, but few mourned his passing. Justice, it seemed, had found its own way of settling old accounts. The military never solved the mystery of how 300 soldiers had been defeated by a band of primitive Indians. Official reports blamed the failure on equipment malfunctions and tactical errors, unable to acknowledge that they had been outfought by people they considered inferior. As for Rebecca Morrison, she was declared officially dead, her case closed and forgotten by authorities who had more pressing concerns. On the frontier, in a way, they were right. That woman had indeed died, replaced by someone stronger, freer, and more complete than she had ever been. Standing here now, 50 years later, watching my great-grandchildren play in the dust of our reservation home, I sometimes marvel at the strange path that brought me to this life. The woman who was chained in a wagon as a punishment bride could never have imagined becoming the matriarch of a family, the keeper of traditions, the bridge between 2 worlds that seemed so irreconcilably different. But perhaps that was always my destiny. written in stars I was too young to read when my journey began. Perhaps every chain that bound me, every cruelty I endured, every moment of despair was preparing me for the moment when red thunder would storm into my life and carry me away to a future I never could have dreamed. The chains are long gone now, rusted away to nothing. But the freedom they taught me to value remains, passed down through generations of children who will never know what it means to be owned by another human being. That, perhaps, is the greatest victory of all, not just my own liberation, but the liberation of all those who came after, free to choose their own paths because someone before them had the courage to break the chains that would have bound them as well. The story ends as it began, with a woman and her choices. But this woman is no longer powerless, no longer afraid, no longer alone. She is White Bird Woman, and she soars free across the endless sky of possibility, carried on wings that no chain could ever bind. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.